Okay, well, obviously, people had a lot to talk about. And what we'd like to do is get some brief reports from each group that we can put into, the notes from the meeting. And since lunch will be waiting for us in just a couple minutes, I think maybe what I'd like to do is just concentrate on the reports, and then we can come back to things later. So, group one, do you have a reporter?
I'll summarize the great discussions we had.
Yeah, I think it's working.
Okay. So we were lucky to have a person in the group from CDSR and another person from NLM CDE repository. So we discussed a lot with them about their use cases and how CDEs are being used. So the point is that CDEs are mainly being used for data collection and creation of case report forms. And okay. And then we discussed the relationship between CDEs and terminologies and how this could be used for search, for example, for data sets in DataMed. So we agreed that CDEs basically provide an abstraction where you have the object, the classes, the properties, and the value domain together with the permissible values, and they capture the questions being asked. So they provide a lot of information like in a pattern that indeed will be useful to find, for example, to compare studies. Because we discussed that in some cases a researcher might want to find, even up to the permissible values, that the studies should be the same in terms of to compare them. But we also discussed that the CDEs alone, even if they are mapped to the terminology, sometimes it's not so easy to relate them in terms of the level of abstraction given by the terminology. So a generic so for example, well, the example is cancer and melanoma or a specific types of melanomas. If the CDE is for a specific type, then a search for cancer might not retrieve it. And this, it's more about implementation and how CDEs can be used. But yeah, there wasn't, it's not that we have a conclusive set of use cases, but we think that exploring CDEs for search could be useful in certain cases. I hope I summarized more or less.
Can I just add one thing to that, too, please? Yeah. So I think another issue, too, that we're also facing is that there are a bunch of different repositories that we're using, right? So we have the NCI repository, there's an NLM repository, and making sure that those identifiers, too, are the same. We do use the NCI thesaurus, the terminology behind that, too. So there is that terminology, and I think that that's where a lot of cases where we can kind of come together using the terminology.
Okay. Group two?
Hi, I'm going to try to be very short. So after all the discussion, I think we can summarize our results under a few headings. One was the harmonization of CDEs. So there's a single CUI-like concept or abstract CDE for each idea, each CDE that we want to represent and use and find and etc. The other idea was CDEs versus forms. So we wanted to make sure that the granularity is there, and we didn't have to use the CDEs at a form level. We should be able to refer, find, include in our forms individual CDEs, not forms. The other idea was to have a single place to search and find CDEs. The researchers should not remember 10 different places to go to find different CDEs, sort of like PubMed for CDE searches. The other two ideas that are somewhat related to our tools. So So the tools that make it easy to build forms that conform to CDE at the design and build level. So the form builder tool that researchers should use should recommend CDEs at the build stage. So when you're trying to type in a name for your question, the tool should tell you that there are already 5 different CDEs from these repositories that you can use. And if you choose to do so, you should be able to just include them in your form and not create the wheel from scratch. Also, our group discussed the idea of tools that help you to upload your already existing forms. Say you have a Word file or a PDF. We all know that this is very technically challenging, but a data dictionary, JSON, XML, whatever you have, and this tool will parse and get back to you with a report saying that you have 10 CDs in here from these repositories, and you have 10 things that are unique. And it might not be perfect, but we felt like having that ability to just upload your design form and get a report back about the conformity to the CDE is a good idea.
Okay, so our group discussed a kind of a complementary topic to groups 1 and 2, and we started off with basically Greg Farber talking about Google and how basically we're not really fighting each other in the biomedical space. We're all fighting anonymity. So the issue is, how do we get more people to actually know about CDEs and know about DataMed and all these great things that could potentially help them? And so we really focus on how do we get researchers to understand that these things are out there. So we had a lot of discussions about data management plans, because now Greg told us, so I'm not sure if any cats are coming out of that, but Greg told us that the data management plans are going to be scored. Therefore, we're essentially done with understanding that all researchers will now learn about CDEs, because that's going to be part of the questions in the data management plan. So that's actually very, very good news. So from that perspective, on the one hand, we're almost in the home stretch. Repositories also need to essentially, they were definitely seen as the key to enforcing a lot of this data and the data standards, including CDEs. And of course, FITBER, which we had representation from in the group, does enforce CDEs, which is fantastic. And each for example, there's this concept of a meta study, which is available in FITBER. It gets a DOI, and that can be attached to a paper, so it's wonderful. We talked a lot about the PDB as a use case for how something like this can happen. But another section that we talked about is the other enforcer is the journal, right? So how do we get the appropriate journals to enforce the appropriate repositories, which then enforce the CDEs, right? So we talked a lot about that and how, Nature actually in PLOS ONE has a list of approved repositories. So this is where DataMed can potentially really help, because these lists are different. They're going to be different between journals, and there are, as we know, 27,000 journals just indexed in PubMed. So what we really need to do is improve the way that journals can kind of come together potentially to one place in order to actually get a nice list of different data repositories. Because as we know, there are thousands of data repositories, many thousands of journals. That is a mess, right? So we need to say, if we can help, these are the repositories that help. And one of the things that makes a repository a good repository is the enforcement of appropriate metadata standards, as we know from Susanna. So that's one of them. And then the other addition to that was that ORCID, so right now I have foreknowledge of a new feature of ORCID, which just came out last week. And what happens is that in ORCID, you can actually get credit now for essentially objects, including data objects. So if the repositories add the ORCID identifier and export their data, the fact that there is an identified data entity that goes into ORCID, then ORCID will be able to essentially give credit. So that's a bit of a carrot to all of the researchers who deposit data in proper data repositories. Okay, so I think that those are the main topics. So,
we didn't actually pick a presenter. Oh wait, is this 4? We're at 4? Yeah, we're at 4. Oh, we're at 4. Okay. Oh, John. Did you pick a number? So I thought I'd take notes because I know the least about this, and so I'm standing in front of you, talking, knowing the least of anyone at the table. So we identified the problem as identifying the intersection between CDEs and discovering data, and not just CDE use in the clinical area, but in data man generally, and then extending CDE concepts to a broader range to include variables to cover more than just human clinical data and be interoperable with more systems. The observation was made that we haven't gotten full payoff yet in use across the different repositories, maybe because too much detail is affecting adoption. And by the way, the detailed notes are at the end of all of this, which can be deleted or not as you wish. The key organizing principle was identified as the fact that abstraction increases as you go from the basic observations to the variables that are used to encode those observations to the overall metadata that provides all the context for those observations. And transformations are required for those various steps. What people want to do is browse using higher level concepts like depression and find more detailed encodings. And the thought was that this can be achieved with mappings, but NIH CDE could have the role of mapping, say, existing instruments to the concepts that they're intended to measure. And this would enable this kind of search by concepts, but arriving at specific instruments and the data sets that use those instruments. We agreed that different repositories would necessarily have different roles or targets, but the important thing is that there be linkages between them, and this is when the globally unique identifier could be raised as a way of achieving interoperability across all these different repositories and institutions. And finally, the need for external validation mechanisms for those authorities who are deciding which are the instruments that are okay for studying depression or similar concepts. Those decisions may need to be decided upon by external authorities and encoded in some way.
Do you want to add?
Oh, sure. So while I had really interesting discussions at my table, I think the most interesting thing is all the groups seem to have particularly different ideas of what a researcher is. And that's actually, that was kind of germane to something we talked about, is that actually depending on who you define as researcher, there's a lot of sort of different value adds. And so that was an interesting thing. But one sort of trend, I guess, across all of them would be education. At least in my domain, most people have no idea what CDEs are and how they would pertain to their lives. With the clinical trials folks, that's a little bit different, but it's a generally different thing. To go specifically to the question, though, and this is sort of a discussion we had at the very, very end of our session. I think one thing that's really important now is, you might have 10 different studies with 100,000 patients each. I mean, this is what's beginning. We're beginning to see these sorts of things. And so it's important to be able to sort of employ a data sieve to say, these are the variables that were actually measured, so these things could potentially be useful to me. And then now now I'm interested in specific combinations of sort of phenotypic measurements. And if you can do that, that is extremely useful to researchers. And where you can get 40 data sets out of 100,000, that kind of thing. Carrie, Rick, anybody on my table? Did I miss anything? No? We're all good?
I think I appreciate the survey did talk about education, so thank you, Ben. You did a really nice job. Also, we're trying, obviously this idea of incentives, et cetera, where does that come from? And, how do we get that? And so this idea, and someone mentioned kind of ORCID and getting kind of credit for sharing data. We love that idea. We talked about that a little bit. And I was sharing that actually as someone from the federal government, we actually have a funding mechanism out there that we're requiring people to reuse data and to combine independent data sets and to answer some novel research questions. And we think those kinds of things, of course, say, now then the use case is, I got to find data that measures X, Y, and Z at certain levels, et cetera. So how do I find those data? So I think hopefully that'll kind of push things along in that way. But hopefully, again, so that's certainly one way that NIH can kind of maybe help and provide incentives or kind of kicks in the butt to do this kind of stuff.
Great. Other comments? Okay, well, yeah.
I want to, because I've partly been responsible for stimulating this difference between the clinical and the non-clinical world, but I also want to try and draw. I think there's a parallel that we're not recognizing, which is basic scientists do have the equivalent of common data elements, or at least the concept of a standardized instrument, right? I mean, if I'm going to go into when I worked in the pharmaceutical industry and we were looking for antidepressants, the scientists were taking off the shelf, right, an animal model of depression. And the equivalents to the things on the forms were things like, well, what are the lever presses of this rat in the Skinner box, or the amount of time it remains immobile. And then when two scientists would get together at a conference, they would be talking in a language that knew their data was comparable because they were both running the same instrument. And they would want to validate that instrument across. And so I think that does exist within the basic science community, and I think we need to recognize where it does and pull that out somehow and what we're doing.
I mean, I just also add from the social science side that we've got lots of surveys, like the National Health Interview Survey, there's a survey called MIDAS, which is interviews with midlife adults, the Health and Retirement Survey, aging, the Adolescent Health Survey, that now include, some of them include results from biomarkers, but they include many of these scales like depression, anxiety scales that appear in the NLM repository and various other things, not to mention all the demographic data. So I think that when we're talking about CDEs, the classifications that are being done for the clinical world actually have implications for other domains as well. So lunch is waiting, and so thanks for all the work, and we'll get back together, say 10 past